Hi, this is Anthony. Welcome back to my show. Have you ever wondered what the most important novel, that is fiction, that's come out of the United States? Well, I would argue that it's the Book of Mormon. Now, of course, the faithful members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, also called the LDS Church or sometimes Mormons, they believe that it's a book that was translated by Joseph Smith from golden plates that recounts the history of the descendants of immigrants from the Holy Land who came to the Americas and eventually were visited by Jesus Christ himself long after he was crucified in Jerusalem. Now, it spawned a fairly small, compared to other religions, but a very powerful church, especially in the state of Utah and along the Mormon corridor of Utah, Idaho, parts of Oregon, Arizona, etc. So many people believe it to be literally true, and it's the basis of their religion. And I'm not here to try to determine what, if any, is the true religion and which isn't. But I think that if you are somebody who follows the Book of Mormon or any book, you need to look at what is the basis of it. What do we know about how it was written? Is it really dictated by God to Moses or Muhammad? Or is it really from a book of golden plates that was buried in a hill and then found by Joseph Smith and then translated from Reformed Egyptian using some type of magical stone or pair of spectacles? Anyway, there's been a number of scholarly arguments that the Book of Mormon was composed by Joseph Smith, but using other sources of information that he kind of fed through his mind and then came up with his own story. So one of them is called the View or A View of the Hebrews. Another is called The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain. So here is from a website called worldtree.org/the-late-war/. And this is called A Comparison of the Book of Mormon and the Late War Between the United States, and it was done in 2014. So I'm going to read you what they have here and then go through some of the examples, which I find very convincing. Faithful Mormons might not, but I think a lot of open-minded people will see that there's a lot of very close similarities. And I looked this up. TLDR, too long, didn't read, just so you know what that means. So, and when they say Joseph, they mean Joseph Smith. Joseph most likely grew up reading a school book called The Late War by Gilbert J. Hunt, and it heavily influenced his writing of the Book of Mormon. And of course, the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. So the summary. In October 2013, the authors conducted a data analysis comparing the Book of Mormon to over 100,000 books from the pre-1830s era. Out of the top matches, we discovered a book called The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain, a scriptural style account of the War of 1812, published in New York in 1816. And what they mean by scriptural style, it's the style that the King James Version of the Bible was written in, kind of a flowery, archaic way of presenting information to make it look like it's from antiquity and therefore strengthen the case that it's from God rather than a farm boy in upstate New York. Okay. Between 1817 and 1819, it was marketed, quote, for the use of schools throughout the United States, unquote, under the title The Historical Reader. So that was an alternative name to this book. One was The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain. The other name for the same book was called The Historical Reader. Okay, so here are parallels. The first column is from the late war, and the second column is from the Book of Mormon. And then when they find matching words or segments of words, they're color coded here. And for instance, in the late war, talking about the 4th of July, the 4th day of the 7th month, which is the birthday of Columbian liberty and independence. In the Book of Mormon, in Alma 10:6, it says the 4th day of the 7th month, which is in the 10th year of the reign of the judges. So extremely close wording. In fact, the only difference in the first section is the word the and this. Okay? Here's another one. Near Moravian town, and it came to pass, the army were under a chief warrior whom they called Tecumseh, smote their chief warrior Tecumseh, and slew him, he fell to the earth. And in the Book of Mormon, the people of Moravian looks very close to Moravian town. And it came to pass, the army was led by a man whose name was Teancum. They did pursue Teancum and slew him. He was dead and had gone the way of all the earth. Again, extremely close between those two passages. More than just random chance would likely indicate. Here's another, and the word striplings we don't use anymore. It's like a strapping young man, okay? 2,000 hardy men who fought freely for their country. Now the men of war were men of dauntless courage. And here in Alma, which is a book of the Book of Mormon, 2,000 of those young men to defend their country. They took their weapons of war, were all young men, and they were exceedingly valiant for courage. This is talking about the Americas. The land most plentiful, yielding gold and silver and all manner of creatures which are used for food, and the huge mammoth that once moved on the borders, it is more wonderful than the elephant. And in Ether, the land exceedingly rich of gold and of silver, and all manner of animals which were useful for food, and of man, and curloms and kumoms, and more especially the elephants. And while the Book of Mormon is written in English, of course, there are a few, one would say, made-up words that don't correspond to anything in English that we know of, but Mormon apologists will often argue that curloms and kumoms are mammoths and mastodons or something along those lines. So very close here. Here's one on forts. The men were prepared, and they let loose their weapons of war and smote with great slaughter, and the deep ditch that surrounds the fort was strewn with their slain and their wounded. And in Alma again, men were prepared with their swords and their slings to smite with an immense slaughter, ditches filled up in a measure with their dead and wounded. Lots of similarities there. Here's some more forts. It came to pass on the 10th day of the 8th month, the people began to fortify and entrench the high places round about the city and build their strongholds. And in Alma, it came to pass on the 10th day of the month, the Nephites had dug a ridge of earth so high round about the city and built a stronghold. Here's one on casualties. Fought, and there were many slain and wounded on both sides. Fought, and there were many slain on both sides. Those are almost word for word there. And some of them are, perhaps less persuasive or might be more likely to be just coincidental. And especially farther down in the document, I would say that that's true. But you compare these two columns, they're just so extremely close that one has to wonder, is the Book of Mormon, based on this earlier book that we know that Joseph Smith no doubt had some familiarity with. Here we go. Standard. Set forth a proclamation abroad, and it came to pass that a great multitude flocked to the standard of Columbia, that they came in battle array against the. Here we have sent a proclamation throughout the land, and it came to pass that thousands did flock unto his standard of liberty. They went down with their armies against the. Cataclysms. Thunders as the mighty earthquake which overturneth cities, and the whole face of the earth overshadowed with black smoke, so that for a time one man saw not another. Sharp rocks had fallen upon them. And in 3 Nephi, or 3rd Nephi, thunder did shake the whole earth, cities were sunk, and the face of the whole earth could feel the vapors of darkness, so that for the space of 3 days that there was no light seen. Great destruction had come upon them. Liahona. So Liahona is a device made, and of course the first column here is the late war. Talks about made partly of brass with curious works like unto a clock, and it wore a huge ball, large ball. And the Liahona in the Book of Mormon in 1 Nephi, a round ball of curious workmanship, and it was a fine brass, and within the ball were 2 spindles. So again, who uses curious works or curious workmanship unless you were copying from somebody who had already used that? The odds of that being independently said, I think, are astronomically small. Weapons. And weapons of war were of curious workmanship, and weapons of war of exceedingly curious workmanship. Again, the fingerprints there, it's almost identical words. Here's some more. It came to pass that the husbandmen gathered together and pitched their tents and assembled together, and the people shouted with a loud voice. And in the Book of Mormon, Mosiah, it came to pass that the people gathered themselves together and pitched their tents. Ye should assemble yourselves together, and they all cried with one voice. Again, so much of the same wording. It came to pass that they gathered together their army, their navy, on the borders of the land of Columbia. And of course, Columbia meaning the United States in 1812. And in Alma, in the Book of Mormon, it came to pass that they gathered together all their people, their flocks, near the border of the land of Zarahemla. That's an unidentified geographic location within the Book of Mormon. Now when Carden heard these words, his heart leapt with joy. Now when he had said these words, his heart was swollen with joy. And the chief warriors gave up their instruments of destruction and laid them at the feet of Jackson. Of course, Jackson was the hero of the War of 1812. And their chief captains threw down their weapons of war at the feet of Moroni. People to rise up, one against another, and their own children. People to rise up in rebellion against their brethren. Go with all our might against their chief city. Go forth with all our might against the Lamanites who were in the city. It came to pass in the same year that the people of Columbia were revenged of the evil. It came to pass in the same year that the people of Nephi had peace restored unto them. So I'm going to stop here. I would really encourage you, if you have any interest, either in just learning more about similarities between the Book of Mormon and these other books. If you're a member of the LDS Church, this might be of interest to you, although it might make you start questioning your faith. I'll have a link in the show notes to this website. Check it out. There's a lot more parallels. Some of them not as strong, or it doesn't have 4 parts like the previous ones that I talked about, but lots of very, very similar ones. So I'll stop here. If you haven't already, please do hit subscribe, hit like, leave a comment. Even if you disagree with me, I'd love to hear from you. I really appreciate it. We'll talk to you later. Thank you.